Hi, it's May 1st, 2026, and we're back with Duckling's Alchemical Soul Theater, concluding our introduction that was in three parts, although there have been an additional three presentations, shorter presentations, to present information that would make this third part more readily available. The purpose of this introduction was to present forgotten truths, hints, and clues for seekers along the way. We're going to include today a little bit on the Pythagorean triangle, on the four elements, the prima materia, and the hungry heart. Before getting there, I want to emphasize that our main focus is on this lower, which here marked in red, section of our tree of life. Here we see the construction trees representing the four worlds in one image. The first psychic knot, as I said, marked in red, has to do with the inversion of the levator ani and the transition from animal consciousness to spiritual awareness. In the temptations of Christ, it has to do with the survival and fear. Key 13, the card of death, hints at the correct and precise use of the levator ani to dissolve the first psychic knot, which is meant to redirect downward energy upward. During the work, it will generate an internal moist heat, facilitating this dissolution. The work of dissolving the three psychic knots is said to be a movement from survival to love and emotion, and ultimately to conscious transcendence. Here's a reminder where we left off in the second stage of our introduction, or the second part of our introduction, where we were approaching Tiferet by three paths, here represented by the three tarot keys, key 15, key 14, and key 13. In key 15, the devil, we see a representation of a chaotic expression of the four elements. On the far right, we can see that key 15 is a path between Hod and Tifereth, here depicted by the magician, and Tifereth by the key of the sun, where key 15 is in between them. We will cover all of these paths that are shown and all these cards that are shown here, but for the moment I just wanted to remind us where we left off before. Here we have a view of the Pythagorean triangle in the center of our slide, and the Pythagorean theorem, which states that 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared, so that 9 plus 16 equals 25. What I found interesting is that the very word eureka, meaning I have found it in Greek, adds up, as we see here, the epsilon through alpha to 534, symbolically the number representing the sides, the vertical side 3, the horizontal side 4, and the hypotenuse, this diagonal line connecting the two, with a 5. On the left side, the vertical side, we see Mercury on top representing Kether, spirit, in key 1 of Tarot, the sulfur in the middle representing Hokmah, the soul, in key 4 of Tarot, and salt representing Binah, understanding, the body, and key 3 of the Tarot. There are different associations of the Tarot that can also be assigned, but for the moment that'll work. These are related in Esoteric Keys to Alchemy by Paul Foster Case. The three principles function as a triune system, where sulfur provides the fire, mercury, the spirit, and salt, the body. My very first words in English were, I got it, which ironically reminds me very much of the Eureka in Greek. The classical elements in ancient Greek philosophy, it should be clarified from the very beginning, has to do with the first and fundamental differentiation of primordial substance, literally the prima materia. This is a quote from Burckhardt in his Alchemy, Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul. Empedocles was the first to, in our records, identify these four elements as archai, objective primordial principles, which he also called rhizomata, roots of the cosmos. So it's important to distinguish that these are not Jungian psychological archetypes. These are primordial principles. Then Evola, in his Hermetic tradition, reminds us and points out that air, water, and fire are only known as manifested through the earth element. What does that mean? The air, water, and fire are only known from our sublunar earth element. Here's another representation of the four elements, described as soul forces that define the elemental qualities. Fire is hot and dry, air is hot and wet, water cold and wet, and the earth is cold and dry. On the bottom we see the triangles that are also represented in our little square, diamond shaped, for fire, air, water, and earth. And here I've just assigned colors to them to help us distinguish them. What's interesting is that the four elements can be reduced to two. What we'll see is that air is more fire than water. Earth is more water than fire. And even more interestingly, fire and water are triangles that are simply inverted images of one another. Here above we see the Platonic solids. Fire represented as tetrahedron, air as an octahedron, water icosahedron, and earth as a cube. The particular images that I'm depicting here are from Johannes Kepler, which I found, I don't know, attractive. What's interesting is that Plato's genius remembered, in Greek it's referred to as anamnesis, and assigned to the four terrestrial elements a geometric structure. Now, this is very significant and yet in some ways difficult because there is something to the geometric structures that helps unfold consciousness, but is very abstract. More so, Plato identified the elements as constructed from triangles that can be pulled apart and reassembled, and they form the faces of the solids. As you may note above, that the tetrahedron has four equilateral triangles, the octahedron, eight equilateral triangles. What's interesting is the Earth has scaling right angle triangles, which in Plato's mind led to some complications. We can't really get into details here because of the fact that this is only an introduction, but I wanted to be clear that Plato's task seemed to have been to effectively bridge geometry with physical substance. Now, Plato was fond of something called mathesis, which is a training for the soul, so to speak, for the soul's recollection, for the soul's remembrance of its divine purpose. Interesting, Plato really didn't define the dodecahedron, but he made a very intriguing comment in his Timaeus. The god used it for arranging the constellations of the whole heaven. Later, Euclid found proofs, mathematical proofs, of the five Platonic solids. Ether, the dodecahedron, was named Zeus, interestingly enough. What I found, how would I say that? A confirming aspect that has stayed with us is that the 12 signs of the zodiac correlate with the 12 faces of the dodecahedron. And that seemed to have, how would I phrase it? It seemed to give some level of status or recognition of its significance as a cosmic or etheric shape is a wrong word because the ether has no shape. Although here we do see it expressed as a Platonic solid. What I like to point out is that subtle distinctions were being established. And then what really got me, which didn't come from after many years of study, of working with the elements, was an earlier recognition that the four elements were related to divinities, the gods of the Greeks. So that fire was Zeus, water, Nestus, air, Adonis, earth, Hera. Fire as Eris, water as Kronos, air as Dionysus, earth as Hades, Hades, and ether as Zeus. This was from a fairly recent work by Barry Kieran, The Greek Kabbalah, Alphabetical Mysticism and Numerology in the Ancient World. So what we're seeing is that there was really no real, how would I call it, agreement on which of the gods would represent which of the elements. But it is fascinating to me that the elements were being represented by names of Greek gods. Ether, as the four elements united by spirit, is a much later alchemical and hermetic association. What I should also point out is that the four elements seem to have been influenced by love and strife. Love united and strife led to multiplicity. Much later on, we'll see, in addition to the four elements, and in this case by Paracelsus, and he referred to elemental spirits, which were conscious elemental beings that Paracelsus emphasized interacted with human constitution, with the human constitution. He named them sylphs for the air, undines for water, gnomes for the pygmies, salamanders for fire. And he wrote fairly extensively on them in his book called De Liber de Nymphes, Sylphs, Pygmies, and Salamanders, Educatiores Spiritibus. Another fairly renowned book in certain circles is Le Comte de Gabalis, written in 1670 by Nicolas Montfaucon, which, if one has read it, it seems a fairly ridiculous combination of things. And Paul Foster Case in the True and Invisible Rosicrucian Order tells us that much information concerning them, veiled in language full of absurdities, if taken literally, may be found in the Comte Gabulus, which we just referred to. Furthermore, Case tells us acquaintance with the commonly called elementary inhabitants was made at Fez, suggesting a veil. Again, Case says a hint that the acquaintance itself was an intellectual conception rather than any form of psychic perception. Hmm. Tobias Shurton, in his book The Golden Builders, Alchemists, Rosicrucians, and the First Freemasons, regarding the elemental tells us belief in the elemental inhabitants implies knowledge of the virtues or divine signatures inherent in things, and speaks of a time before the poetic and truly imaginative consciousness was sundered from academic science. Hmm. I continue with Shurton. He points out that Dr. Erasmus Darwin, the grandson, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, used the images of the elemental creatures to announce his important botanic garden, calling them Rosicrucian. And furthermore, Tobias says to study the elements in plants, animals, and minerals in order to discover their mysterious inner life was magia naturalis and is the origin of modern botany and genetics. More intriguingly, he defines magia naturalis and says that it might yet reveal man's truest nature, and adds nature veils consciousness, and the Fama announces the unveiling. The Fama is a Rosicrucian document, which we'll have more to say on later. Here, to sum up, I provided some references for the four elements and the elementals. I'm not going to bother reading them because you can always stop and take a look on yourself. In red are those that I found most telling, but all of them are interesting. Here's a quote from the Book of Tokens by Paul Foster Case on the magician. From my substance all things derive their substance, and all that hath form is built from my fourfold elemental manifestation. Four are the subtle principles which the wise conceal from the uninitiated by the names fire, water, air, and earth. In endless variety of mixture and proportion, directed by my will, these mingle together for the production of forms. They are transmutations of a single essence, and from their mingling are brought forth all things. In this slide, we see the four elements again. And here, I've cut out from the tarot cards and placed underneath each of the elements the four creatures that are shown or are described by Ezekiel. But here I wanted to point out that they're associated with the four fixed signs of the zodiac: Leo, Aquarius, Scorpio, and Taurus. And underneath, there's a picture from Chartres Cathedral in France, where we see that the four creatures are also depicted as the four evangelists: Mark, Matthew, John, and Luke. And in the two tarot keys on the right, we see them also depicted. Here's a quote from Ezekiel 1:10 in the King James Version. As for the likeness of their faces, they four had the face of a man, and the face of a lion, on the right side, and day 4 had the face of an ox on the left side. Day 4 also had the face of an eagle. We'll see a similar quote in Revelations 4:7. And as you can see here under living creatures, I've emphasized or I've pointed out where we can find quotes of them in Ezekiel 1 and 10, in Revelations 4, 5, 6, 14, 15, and 19. Although it's not quite clear what they are, but we're starting to unfold a mystery. The Sphinx that we see in the top of the wheels in both keys, shown here on the far right, represents a synthesis of the four elements, a symbol of the soul informing matter, a fixed state of the elements. So now I'm making a move from an abstract depictions of the four elements to more experiential encounter with them. Personally, I've had multiple encounters with indigenous traditional religions, both American, Cuban, although today it's also fairly well spread, Santeria in the United States. These traditional religions tend to be earth centered and animistic. In other words, they recognize that all is spirit. One of the most significant things about these indigenous traditional religions that also have been referred to as shamanic traditions involves soul travel, spiritual journeys that actually provide access to the four worlds. They tend to use drumming, dance, song, medicinal herbs, and trance. Trance is very complicated, so I'm not going to go into it. But I want to emphasize that the trance that I found most beneficial, one remains consciously aware during the entire process. All of them, whether drumming, dance, or in conjunction, lead to expansion of consciousness. The other very significant aspect of the indigenous religions is that they are encompass a reciprocal exchange with Mother Nature, making offerings, admiring her beauty, and most of all, being gratitude, expressing gratitude in being. They also include awareness of place and being, machwan in Hebrew. Geometrically, it adds up to 186, which is the same as the letter Kaf, representing the card of the moon, shown here on the right, lower right. The indigenous religions were labeled primitive and suppressed in the United States for many years. Historically, they were labeled in derogatively fashions, and yet today they are the key to the higher worlds. According to Angela Rotan in her work on shamanic travels of Jesus and Muhammad, cross-cultural and transcultural understanding of religious experience, she points out that there's been an effort to recover the cultural webs across the world that were ignored, suppressed, and forgotten. In this slide, what was through my engagement, and it's interesting because my first encounter was with Izzy was out in nature, ironically enough, was to recognition that Izzy, or Israel Bel Shem Tov, the best, was a Jewish shaman. Yes, a Jewish shaman. His ascent of the soul moved through the layers of the four elements. His preaching of Devakut, communion, what I would say embracing God, may be completely achieved by each individual, he stated. A spiritual act performed through means of concentration and contemplation. Concentration and contemplation. All spheres, even the most mundane, are thoroughly imbued with the awareness of God's presence. This quotes from Sholem on the mystical shape of the Godhead, basic concepts in Kabbalah. Furthermore, Izzy was fond of ecstatic dance, of smoking, and connecting with Mother Nature. But here I wanted to point out that the ecstatic dance goes all the way back to Exodus 15, where we read about Miriam's circle dance. It was new to me to discover that in the Acts of John, they describe Jesus and the apostles after the Last Supper also engaged in a circle dance. Sarah Schneider in Miriam's circle dance describes the world of formation is called the circle universe, formed of concentric circles, while the world of action is the linear world of straight lines and hierarchy. She emphasizes three parallel lines. Hmm. So, as we're moving deeper into an understanding of our descent from spirit, we're gaining some knowledge of the spiritual anatomy that we'll need to encounter. What surprised me even more after discovering that shamanism and Judaism, especially through from Izzy, was that shamanism was a deep aspect of the Greek religious and philosophical faith, the Greek soul journeys. For the moment, we're going to focus on Plato, his cave allegory. The visible realm should be likened to the prison dwelling, and the study of things above as the upward journey of the soul to the intelligible realm. That's in Plato's Republic 7. In the Phaedo, he tells us philosophy equals the practice for dying and death. And at the end of his Republic, his myth of is a classical shamanic journey. Or the protagonist in was to be a messenger to human beings, delineating the soul's immortality. To summarize this quickly, I've put down references for the Jewish shamanic experiences, Ascensions on High in Jewish mysticism by Moshe Dell, Along the Path by Elliot R. Wolfson, Shamanic Trance in Modern Kabbalah by Jonathan Garb, Miriam's Circle Dance by Sarah Schneider. The ones that are not highlighted in red are also very significant. But these four, for me, were the most relevant. Regarding the Greeks' association with shamanism or indigenous faiths, The Greeks and the Irrational by Dodds, Psyche by Irwin Road, served to really enlighten me regarding how the ancient indigenous traditions have always provided the method of ascent in our four world structure. So, as we're talking about ascending in consciousness, we see here on the left the hypotenuse of this Pythagorean triangle has five segments: the mineral, the vegetable, animal, man, and what's referred to here as Superman. Another quote by Case from the Book of Tokens on Aleph: first the stone, then the plant, then the animal, then the man. But before the stone, I am the fire, distributed equally in space, nowhere absent, filling all. Here we're using the tarot key of the moon, the symbol of Kuf, the back of the head, the letter Kuf. On the far right is number 18 from Paul Case's Builders of the Addendum Tarot. In the transformational tarot, some of these elements have already been incorporated in the evolving nature of our consciousness. So here I use this because it's simpler to detail the symbolism of the mineral, which of course in our bodies would be the bones, the teeth, the nails, as the stone highlighted here by the arrow. The plant kingdom, of course, we see in the grass and the growth of green plants refers to our vital and etheric body. The animal kingdom is represented here by the wolf and the dog, the astral soul body. The towers, which are made by the hands of man, representing our works and the dawning self-consciousness. And what on the triangle is represented as Superman's, I've called here adepts and Magid. They're at the top of the purple mountains that are barely seen in the background. This depicts the evolution of consciousness, but also the evolution of the earth. And the various stages of the incorporation of the human body. In our next slide, on the left side, we see the transformational tarot representation of the moon. On the right, we see the one from Boda. And what I'm emphasizing here is a consciousness of body. And our first quote is from Warren Kenton, Kabbalistic Universe, where he points out that a human being has to develop a separate and effective organism in each world, so that as we evolve in consciousness, we need an appropriate vehicle to engage the higher frequency, the higher vibrational energy that's flowing into our consciousness. We'll expand on that more as we go along. Subconsciousness builds all bodies. Subconsciousness builds all bodies. Another quote from the Book of Tokens by Paul Case: I am the sum of all perfections, the decad multiplied by itself. In this my number shall be found a key to the bringing forth of form. This is meditation from the letter Kof in key 18. The 29th path of Kof forms every body which is formed in all the worlds, and is the reproduction of them. In the hieroglyphic monad by John Dee, in a section called Metathesis, more light can be found. Manly P. Hall, in the Occult Anatomy of Man, tells us that the great celestial hierarchy of Scorpio has charge of all bodybuilding in nature. These elements are the invisible intelligence, intelligences governing the human body and its function. The invisible intelligences. Invisible intelligences. Hmm. From man's mental reactions to his environment, he distills the product of experience, which then aids him to regain his lost position, plus an individualized intelligence. His lost position plus an individualized intelligence. But what's this about mental reaction to his environments? Are we suggesting that the invisible intelligences react to mental states, to how we react to the experiences that we encounter here in this physical plane, the world of Asiya? Something to contemplate and think about. Manly P. Hall, quoting Paracelsus in The Secret Teachings of All Ages, says, "The body comes from the elements, the soul from the stars, and the spirit from God. All that the intellect can conceive of comes from the stars, the spirits of the stars, rather than the material constellations." The spirits of the stars rather than the material constellations. Paracelsus pointed out that the alchemical transmutation was impossible unless the alchemist himself was in the process of transformation. So that alchemy is not something that we perform out there, but something that we perform inside. We continue with the consciousness of body. For it's important that we recognize that evolution isn't a random mutation or survival of the fittest, but a top down process or inner out process. It's a subtle fire or spirit increasing its vibration, where we witness matter rearranging itself to accommodate that higher vibration. A plant's nervous system cannot hold the fire of human self awareness. Biology evolved for improved receptivity to spirit. Note, first the plant, then the animal, before the man. The animal phase, fear, survival, and instincts, that's part of what we're working on today, that first knot. The plant phase, the evolution equals remembrance, the anamnesis of the soul. The psychic knot, the illusion, mirror, looking glass reflector, the veil. Dissolving the first psychic knot involves reversal. Here we see three representations of our tree. One in the middle, representing the world of action. To the right, we see the interface of psyche and action. And the left, we see the psychic world. What's important here is to recognize that in this lower triangle of the psychic world, Warren has written vegetable man on the passive responsive side. Again, we see vegetable man on the active responsive side. And we see vegetable man under the Mars juncture between Venus and Mercury, which he's entitled here desires. That Mars junction, which I referred to, is also the threshold, which we see on the far right. The threshold is between feeling and awakening, between vegetable man and animal man. Bina, Aima, Chokma, Abba. In our middle panel, we see them written in black so that they're clear to see. And Tifrith in the world of action. According to Warren, this is a human mental vegetable level. The supernal triad, which would be Ima, Abba, and Kether, he details Warren, that is, as the human animal level. On the far left, we see that again in the downward pointing triangle between Mercury, Venus, and the moon, involving the vegetable man, in the upward pointing triangle between Mercury, Sun, and Venus is labeled the animal man. In the far right, we see that that's the stage of awakening. The soul between the upper and lower phases of Jisira constitutes the subtle body of the psyche. This is probably best seen in the far right, where we see the word soul between what Warren labels as passive emotion and active emotion. And of course, with Tiferet, Sandalphon, it's a small downward pointing triangle, which on the far left we see as the self, Jupiter, and Mars, labeled self-consciousness, and individual, which represent our soul, subtle body, according to Warren, in a Kabbalistic universe. Oh, what a busy slide. The main panel, what we're looking at is our autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is a vegetative part of our nervous system. It was already identified as such by Ryle in 1807, or named by such. We keep that name, and it's relevant. This picture I borrowed from Kuhaluk and others, a narrative review in Internal Journal Molecular Science, where he's looking at the integrative neuroimmune role of parasympathetic nervous system, the vagus nerve, the gut microbiota in stress modulation. I recommend it for those who are interested. It's actually a very technical paper, very informative, very technical paper. And for our purposes, we're only wanting to focus on the different connections. On the far left is our parasympathetic nervous system, which is in blue, and the sympathetic in red. It's important to recognize that our vegetative nervous system pretty much regulates the involuntary functions that are essential for life. The two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, provide fight or flight, or rest and digest. Basically, keeping things in balance without our having to pay any active attention to it. But we can interact with it consciously by practicing rhythmic breathing, which leads the diaphragms to massage the intestines. This is primarily activating the vagus nerve through a two-way communication between the brain and the viscera, our internal organs, which you'll recall from before are associated with Yod or Virgo, seen below on this card. And it's the foundation for raising consciousness, for awakening the inner fire. Key 8, strength, and key 9, the hermit, are associated with the functions of digestion, fermentation, and absorption. Here I just want to mention quickly that extreme childhood trauma can cause a rent in the psyche, a split in the psyche. Extreme childhood trauma can cause a rent in the psyche. The above diagram suggesting that the hydrogen sulfide system as well as oxytocin system may help regulate the brain-heart interaction. But of course, as we can see from the left side, that is also directly tied in to the viscera and the card of represented by Yod, the hermit, and Virgo in our system. The authors here suggest that meditation may be beneficial for these psychic rents that can occur from extreme childhood trauma. Now I want to revert to what we talked about with the viscera and fermentation. In a previous talk, we generated 3 talks, additionally to the 2 introductory talks, that should provide a foundation to better understand this introduction, this third introduction. And in one of the talks, there was a lot of discussion about Exodus, fermentation, leavened and unleavened bread. And here I wanted to emphasize that this fermentation alchemically is an interior process. So Jesus' parable of the leaven, in which a woman took leaven and put it into three parts of meal, and Jesus that is, referred to that as the kingdom of heaven, that the kingdom of heaven was like a woman adding leaven to 3 parts of meal. So internal cooking we identify with fermentation. Alchemically, previously discussed already, key 15, the devil, is referred to as fermentation. But here, I don't want to repeat myself. So if you're interested in finding out more, go back to the previous talks. What I want to emphasize here these are all scientific papers, which I'm not going to read all of them. It's not important. What is relevant is that microbial fermentation is integral components of the molecular circuitry that regulates immune and metabolic functions. So we're finding out from 2025, although this has been known a little bit earlier, but this is a very recent papers I've searched out for us. Microbial fermentation, integral components of the molecular circuitry that regulates immune and metabolic functions. The middle reference I find a little amusing, although I'm very aware of this kind of research, but it's that the fecal microbiota transplants can be beneficial. What are we talking about? Literally, poop transplants. That the fermentation in a human large intestine has beneficial processes, beneficial. To me, it's hard to explain that we're talking about transplanting poop from one person or being to the other, and it has beneficial effects. Literally, vile materials are recognized as the most sacred spirit. Reminds me of when Paracelsus in Basel brought a big turd to show to the physicians there, emphasizing that God is in all things. He had to run out of Basel for his life, but in any event, modern science seems to be proving him right. Now, here we come to a warning, and this is something to be taken very seriously. For the purposes of this introduction, is to help us get home, not to lose our minds, go crazy, or worse yet. Here's a quote from Warren Kenton in A Kabbalistic Universe. Attaining this level of being requires that angelic or advanced human beings come to the aid of those below. And we have Izzy on his Epistle of the Ascent of the Soul, where he humbly says, "And I ask my teacher and master that he come with me, as it is a great danger to go and ascend to the supernal worlds, whence I had never ascended since I acquired awareness." Raphael Patai in Jewish mysticism rehashes a fairly, how would I call it, a fairly well known quote about entering Pardes, the mystical orchard. Caused the death of one of the four stages, the loss of mind to the second, and the third led to apostasy, loss of faith. Only the fourth, the great Rabbi Akiba, ascended in peace and descended in peace. And St. Paul in Galatians reminds us, as children we were enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. The savory is a risk of the astral body being diverted at best by these spirits' phantoms during their interior soul journey. To continue with the warning, Paracelsus, in his Liber de Nims, etc., cautions us to learn as much as possible about ourselves and the place we intend to travel to before undertaking an ascent of the soul. The shamanic journey requires the vehicle to be clothed in divine light, the Selem, where it remains vulnerable to these lower entities which attempt to pull the soul back into material bondage. Sholem, on the mystical shape of the Godhead, basic concepts in Kabbalah tells us the Selem is used in the context of creation of man in the image of God, as stated in Genesis 1:26, the principium individualis of a person, man's occult self, is manifest in this psychic body. And he continues, the sapphire ether is that which surrounds the person, the surrounding ether. This refers to the contemporary doctrine of ambience nos air, the ether surrounding us. And he says, the term used in Paracelsus' work on nymphs, sylphs, and pygmies. Fascinated that Sholem was reading Paracelsus' work on nymphs, sylphs, and pygmies. Get a little lighter now. We get to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. On the far right, we see the rabbit rushing to his rabbit hole. The rabbit hole is an initiation into the subconscious, the dance of the four elements, Malkuth, information, which is Tiferet in Asiya, Yesod, information, or Doth in Asiya. Recall that rabbits are renowned for their prolific fertility, the urge to manifest. In Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, she encounters anthropomorphized cards, the four suits, which equal the four elements. In Wonderland, the elements are shuffled and out of control, tossed around by our emotions, the heart, our physical needs, the diamonds, sharp thoughts, the spades, or primal drives, the clubs. So entering the rabbit hole is reminiscent of vitriol, visita interiora tierra rectificando invinis occultum lapidem. Visit the interior of the earth. By rectification, you will find the hidden stone. In alchemical recipe, the hidden stone, the ether, plasma. The word stone itself is eben in Hebrew, which is equivalent to bina. Eben represents stone, but also the union of Ab and Ben, father and son. And bina, of course, is Ima, the mother, the sphere of understanding. But bina hides within it Ben, Yah, Ben, son, and Yah, father. This stone is not found in the clouds, but hidden inside the densest part of the earth, after cooked by the internal fire. We're going back to the three keys that we said are necessary to cross the paths in entering Tiferet. Key 15, Ayin. The eye is the organ of vision, the path from Hod intellect, where Alice struggles with the embodiment of emotions, ungovernable passions, blind fury, and arbitrary, tyrannical authority, is the Queen of Cups. Legion, the bondage to multiplicity of physical appearances. Key 14, Temperance, Samek. The middle pillar, the bridge, Yesod crossing the threshold, the tower, Pei, directly to Tiferet. From Yesod to Tiferet, crossing the threshold, which we mentioned earlier, that Warren thought very significant. The link between the vegetable and animal parts of our being, of our nature, our inner nature. alchemical balancing of the lunar reflections, the straight and narrow, integrating the side paths of intellect and desire. Key 13, death, noon, the path from Netzach, desire, thwarted desires, fantasies, value possessions, and egoistic identification, stripping shells of past identities, death of the old form to reach the new power. These three paths lead from the personal minor triad of feeling, Yesod, Hod, Netzach, up to the sun, Tifereth, the personal minor triad of awakening consciousness. Alchemy is concerned with occult physiology. By acquiring a working knowledge of his own body's physiology, the alchemist was able to gain a degree of control over it. This is cited from The Secret History of the World, Mark Booth. To visit the interior, the cave, the vegetable phase, the subconscious, the gut, and the lower pelvic regions, the raw, unrefined earth of your own nature. Rectification, the reversal, rectifying means to make straight, to correct. By reversing the downward flow of energies, we rectify the fire, sublimating it. The corporal consciousness, sensory experiences must be dissolved from within to attain the soul beyond form. The opposition of the two poles is overcome only on the highest level in pure being, Burckhardt, in Alchemy, Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul. In the far right, we have an interesting image from Robert Flood. Which is very deep in its metaphysical exposition. As a reminder, body consciousness originates in Yetzirah, and I previously spoke about the fact that Yetzirah includes two inclinations. Yetzirah by Gematria is 315. 315 is also the Gematria of Ha-Olam Ha-Katan, the microcosm. But interestingly, 315 is also by Gematria Adam Ruah, the evil man, and it's the same Gematria as Amora, which we pronounce Gemora. Gemora in the Bible was related to a place of sexual perversions, imbalance, corruption, distorted desires. Recall the four elements, little subconscious intelligences make up our body, Guf, in Yetzirah, and respond to thoughts and emotions, which we must learn to balance and purify. John Dee's hieroglyphic monad is recondite, yet one of the most clear exposition of the four elements that are available in print. Knowledge and understanding of the doctrine of the microcosm, the body, the kingdom is essential before one can really engage the great work. With this slide, it's important to take a look at all that it contains, for the Tarot is unveiling to us secrets. And we're still focusing on consciousness of the body. And I want to say summarize is unfair because I'm only really extracting a few pieces of information that Case, in his analysis of the true and invisible Rosicrucian order, which focuses on the bodily regeneration required for the great work, and he reveals certain secrets of the microcosm. I'm only extracting tidbits, hints, and clues. And it's important to recognize that this is not following a particular order. I'm jumping in already at the place of Damkar in CRC's journey, which is really unfair. And if you're not familiar with it, then I suggest that you need to pick it up and study it, because otherwise you will miss out on what message is trying to be conveyed. Damkar is referred to as a temple of initiation in the initiate's own body. Further, Case breaks it down into Dam, which in Hebrew means blood, and Kar, which Case tells us means lamb. So that the word Damkar, the temple of initiation, is the blood of the lamb. Now, something that struck me for years. I've been familiar with this work of Case for many years now. And Case cites a footnote from Waite's The Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. And in that process, he brings up the blood of the ass. This struck me because Case goes on for about 2 paragraphs describing this blood of the ass and calling Waite, or suggesting that Waite can be referred to as an ass himself, and goes on to talk about secret rituals of the Rosicrucians and says that Waite was being disingenuous. I was surprised because Case is an adept, and so was Waite. But what intrigued me the most is that is not at all mentioned in the very early release of the true and invisible Rosicrucian order. And I thought to myself, what is going on here? What is Case trying to tell us? As I said, Case was an adept. And he brings out a piece of information that Waite put into a footnote and includes it in the main body of the text. Now, I will say as an aside, that has been one of the most valuable pieces of information from the true and invisible Rosicrucian order for me personally. What I will say is, in addition to Quate's, I basically put together Waite and Case in one Freudian slip, one can say. But anyway, getting back to this reference to the blood of the ass or the blood of the lamb, is that Jesus rode triumphantly on an ass to Jerusalem, and that car not only means lamb in Hebrew, but saddle, a saddle or enclosure, sacrum, the levator ani. And remember that Jesus, the vine, during the Last Supper, the cup contained his blood, that he was born in a manger in Bethlehem, the house of bread. Intriguingly, Damkar by Gematrias 264, which is the same gematria for the word Jordan, which Case tells us is the water of minerals. So we're still in the consciousness of body, and in Case's incredible interpretation of the true and invisible Rosicrucian order. And I've cut here to that after the work of regeneration at Damkar, there is a journey and short stay in Egypt, the sphere of subconsciousness and captivity. Egypt equals a stage of investigation of the evolution of consciousness through the vegetable and animal kingdoms. Egypt is a stage of investigation of the evolution of consciousness through the vegetable and animal kingdoms. Somehow I seem fond of these warnings. It's a warning. The exploration of the earlier phases of conscious manifestation is dangerous. It's dangerous because it is attractive and easy for us to get diverted by what is unfolded there. Latent powers that one must recognize, one must know, and one must master. But before we can do that, we must have fully mastered the work in Damkar, which is the established consciousness that of myself I can do nothing. The established consciousness that of myself I can do nothing. Key 20 depicts Osiris, Isis, and Horus rising from coffins. Note, these are the names on the Pythagorean triangle, and we see them here in key 20 on the left side of the statement. The god powers of Egypt, the subconscious forces, should always ascend naturally. The god powers of Egypt, the subconscious forces, when awoken from latency, should always ascend naturally. And that naturally is a hint to the key 17, which represents meditation in our natural intelligence. Zadi, which sublimates, she raises by utilizing itself as a fish hook. She raises the fish, she lifts the fish, which we see here on the right. Zadi, the fish hook at 17, the card of the star, and the fish, Nun, the card of death. She raises the fish. If you're familiar with Waite's cube of space, we'll see that that is the appropriate and right form of manifestation for our natural intelligence sublimating the fish. from the waters. We don't have time to get into that. This is simply an introduction that in many ways is much more thorough than I had intended. Here's an interesting slide from Bruno Bingelli in his Premium Mobile, Dante's Journey in Modern Cosmology. I'm not going to get into too much detail about it, for he has done that, and this is not really. I had told myself I would not discuss physics in this presentation, and here I am, but only limiting it to this because modern physics is very, very interesting. Um, and as I said, I wasn't going to discuss it in full, but it's important to point out that he associates in Dante's journey the fall with gravity. Lucifer fell and disturbed the lowest of your elements. This is a direct quote from Dante. This means that Lucifer structured the world through his fall, especially hell and purgatory, as shown in the diagram on the left. This is Bruno Bengelli. In astrophysics, it is the gravitational force that forms the structure of the universe on a large scale. Bruno Bengelli wrote a wonderful book in German called the Prima Mobile Dante's Jenseitsreise in die moderne Kosmologie. Unfortunately, I don't know that it has been translated to English yet, but he did give a talk in Italy that's entitled The Prima Mobile Dante's Journey in Modern Cosmology, which is a fairly abridged version since it's only maybe 16 pages, so compared to a 500-page book. But he, but that's available on the internet for those interested. One of the things that intrigued me is this whole notion of Lucifer. We'll find that in the King James Bible, he's only mentioned once, and that's in Isaiah, where he's referred to as Hillel, to shine or boast, and it's a reference to the king of Babylon. In the Vulgate, it was transferred as Lux Ferre, light bringer, which is known as Venus. In Revelations 22:16, in the Greek, Jesus is referred to as a bright morning star. In 2 Peter and Revelation 2:28, they refer to the morning star. So this one this one mention of Hillel um, with the association of Lucifer, I can't get into it, but I was fascinated by it because it seems that it's a disparate association with the morning star. And I won't get into that. But what I wanted to point out is that esoterically, Noga, which is the Hebrew word for Venus, hints at its dual nature, as I discussed in one of the previous presentations, one of the short previous presentations. The morning star refers to its ascent and illumination. Venus as an evening star refers to its descent and desire. Noga implies that liminal space between light and shadow. Here is a fascinating, again, this is now from Bruno Bingelli's presentation focusing on Dante's movement from the Inferno to Purgatorio. And I'm not going to read the quotations that he um, put in there. I was actually fascinated by the images and what actually is going on. The quotations are significant. As I said, you can always stop the presentation and read them on your own or read Dante. I mean, it's a wonderful read. The turning point at the midpoint of the hip must pivot into the ascent of the soul. Down becomes up, which astonishes, confuses, and irritates Dante. The heavy strain and rugged work suggest increased gravity. Gravity symbolizes evil or the inclination for evil deeds. It is said, evil pulls someone down or causes to fall down. This is quoting Bruno Bengelli, although I must admit I had to shorten it a little bit. So if there's any misquotes, it's I take absolute credit for anything that is misspoken, but it's pretty much true to the essence of what he was saying. It's just that they were too long, the quotations. As I said, I recommend that you read his Prima Mobile Dante's Journey in Modern Cosmology. It's a wonderful read, and we'll leave it at that for the moment. Virgil, instead of fighting the weight of existence, uses it as the foundational stone for ascent. Lucifer is the point to which all weights from every part are drawn. That's a direct quote from Dante, which is also seen above. A compressed, frozen, and inert state, lead, Saturn, gravity, prima materia that must be transformed, flipping his head to where his feet were. The hip pivot to move past Lucifer. Virgil, who's Dante's guide in this journey, must literally grip the shaggy hair of the fallen angel, the force that pulls down, swings Dante up, integrating below to reach the above. You use the weight of your own mortal cup, the hip, as the fulcrum for your spiritual lever. You use the weight of your own mortal cup, the hip, as the fulcrum for your spiritual lever. Dante makes a perplexing remark. I raised my eyes, believing I should see the half of Lucifer that I had left. Instead, I saw him with his legs turned up, and if I then become perplexed, and if I then become perplexed, do let the ignorant be judges, those who cannot understand what point I had just crossed. Well, don't know what to say. We're still focusing on sacred esoteric anatomy, and I want to draw parallels here between what Dante described as his journey and some of our other protagonists during sacred journeys. Jacob was touched at the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint. Genesis 32:25. Jacob's struggle with a man and God, in this case, the God name is Elohim, Genesis 32:28. An angel, Malach, Hosea 12:4, suggest that he was marked by grace, reflecting a transformation. Marked by grace, reflecting a transformation. His name was changed to Israel. Aeneas has his hip crushed by a rock in the Iliad. He was also marked by grace as a man of destiny. Aeneas and Jacob are injured in the hip, marking a site of divine and physical transformation. In esoteric traditions, the cup of the hip is the hinge of the soul's orientation, the pivot between the material and spiritual worlds. Key 13, The skeleton is depicted with a distortion of the acetabulum. The hip socket. In Dante's Inferno, the hip is where we turn, rectificando. Dante must pivot at Lucifer's hip to reverse the direction from below the Inferno to commence his ascension to purgatory. In Virgil's Aeneid, Book 6, Book 6, I'm speaking German here by accident, destiny revealed in the underworld journey, although maybe not. Maybe it's a simple Freudian slip when I consider the difference between the Germany and the English 6. Toward the founding of Rome, Book 12. Aeneas wounded in the thigh by a straight arrow, by a stray arrow. Only his mother Venus can heal him with an herb, dittany. Fascinating. It seems that all the protagonists struggle at this hip juncture. If I recall correctly, Jacob limps from then on, or should I say Israel. You cannot pass the great hinge without a total structural change. Another one of our myths, the Grail Fisher King, spends his time angling for fish, the soul's vitality, which is latent in the waters of the unconscious. Note key 13, noon, the fish. Scorpio is the dissolution of the old self to allow the life force or generative power to rotate toward a higher state of consciousness. Ichthys, fish. In its initials, we see the words in English, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. What's fascinating to me is that in John 12:32, Jesus stated, and I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. Note his passive use. If I be lifted up from the earth, Jesus is lifted. We don't do the lifting. We are lifted. Dante's perplexing remark after the pivot reflects the shift from material gravity to spiritual levity. He has literally passed through the rectum of the world and entered the realm of Jasad, the moon foundation, the vegetable soul. Note, key 9, the hermit, equals the Virgo constellation depicted holding a sheaf of wheat, the brightest star Spica, an ear of grain is its literal meaning. Spica, ear of grain, the key to the vegetable body. Virgo key 9 is the opposite and complement to Pisces, key 18. The hermit, Virgo, is the hidden seed. Recall, which already expounded in a previous presentation, Virgo rules the intestines, the site of digestion, where the outside world is converted into the blood of the Lamb, vitality, the blood of the Lamb, which equals Damkar. Here we see again Ayin, Samek, and Nun, which veil the light of self knowledge. Penetrating this veil, according to Ann Davies, is Christ consciousness. Tiferet is not fully manifested until the spheres of Geburah and Hesed have been incorporated. But I decided not to show them yet because we're way off from that. We haven't entered Tiferet, let alone talk about it being fully manifested. But it is important to be aware that entering Tiferet may appear to be the path of the lesser adept, but that the energy of Tiferet is not fully manifested until the spheres of Geburah and Hesed have been fully incorporated. Let's get back down to more reasonable levels. Below the threshold of personal triad of feeling, the threshold of the personal triad of feeling. So we're talking about the moon, Mercury, and Venus. Above that threshold, remember the threshold is a path of Pe, of Mars, the tower in Tarot. Above that threshold, the personal triad of awakening consciousness, the Mercury, Venus, and Sun triad. These triads, as we can see if we look at the image on the left, are bifurcated by the path of Samek, the guardian angel of temperance, or should I say, the guardian angel which tempers us, creating four smaller triads, right angles stemming from the cross formed by the bifurcation of the path of Pe, Halavi, a Kabbalistic universe. The threshold of consciousness, the 27th path of Mars, is the border and link, as I've already stated, of the vegetable and animal man. Note that now I add blood to the animal man. It's a beautiful image of the Black Madonna in Einsiedeln, Switzerland. I am black and beautiful, quote from the Song of Songs 1:5. Jean Haney in The Black Virgin tells us the Black Virgin is a symbol of first matter, of subconsciousness. The first matter is dark, absolutely unformed, precedes every manifestation. Both Burckhardt and Evola tell us that materia prima, the primary substance of the world, and the basic substance of the soul. Materia prima is a primary substance of the world and the basic substance of the soul. It is dark and ungraspable, dark and ungraspable essence. The Great Mother can be terrifying, tyrannical, representing death, time, and space. Ama. The Great Mother can be sublimely beautiful, lovingly embracing all creatures. Ima depends on our constitution, depends on the amount of inner work that we have done, how we encounter her. The dark night is a personal triad of feeling. John on the cross, Teresa of Avila are primary examples which many of us have heard of. And this personal triad of feeling in our dark night, as we try to organize this dark, disorganized earth, brings up early childhood memories, erupting from the depths, repressed, suppressed, rejected parts of the self surface and need integrating. Surrender and death of the ego, the personality, purification of the sensory faculties, a de identification with our personality, with our body, which are not one and the same. For me personally, that was one of the most difficult things to recognize that the personality and the body are not one and the same. Two distinct parts of the whole. The personal triad of feeling requires complete self surrender. We'll face existential doubt and extreme fear. The dark night is represented by the personal triad of awakening consciousness. As the light from Tiferet penetrates the subconscious through key 14, our guardian angel is experienced as dramatic and painful purification of the spirit. Generational, racial, and ancestral memories, things that are hard to understand for we didn't personally experience them. Emotional trauma is carried in the body as part of our psychic knots, and they can be really physically painful. Note the lymphatic system represents our emotional cleansing. The word lymph itself comes from nymph in Greek, a being or creature linked to clear streams. The mermaids that we hear about, they can be loving and they can be treacherous. Lympha, from the ancient Roman deity of fresh water, the Latin. These systems are part of our vegetable system. Many people have heard of lymphatic draining, lymphomas. It's not an easy thing to experience. The emotional trauma that the body carries and needs to release. The mystical death involves a darkness of memory. We forget who we are, who we were, even forget our names, like Alice in her adventures. It's delusion, personal failure, and defeat is all that comes to mind. Teresa de Avila was great at describing that. The darkness of will, rejection by loved ones, feeling abandoned by God. There is no greater pain than feeling abandoned by those one loves, by the very light that seems to shine no more. The purification of intellect. Nothing makes sense anymore. Life as we know it falls apart before our very eyes. These are very difficult challenges. Makes one wonder, why am I undergoing this? The shells of the dead, the klipa, the unbalanced forces, shells that conceal the divine light, acting as spiritual obstacles. They cause us to react with hatred, anger, separation, intolerance, and rigidity. Izzy comes and reminds me that in all things there is a hidden spark expressing the divine image. And when they too will be able to perform acts of unification of the Almighty and spiritual ascents like you, then all the husk will cease to exist. From the Epistle of the Best, Izzy. Idel, in Astral Dreams in Judaism in 12th to 14th centuries, reminds us that names do not only designate objects, nor do they only coexist with things, as in some natural visions of language. They are also entities permeating the spiritual realm and constituting a continuum between the angelic and the human worlds. From Rhodes and Psyche, the body obeys death, the Almighty, but the image of the living creature lives on, since this alone is derived from the gods. The dead are constituents of the consciousness of unity. Mark Booth, in his Secret History of the World, tells us extreme childhood trauma can cause a rent in the psyche through which phantoms, spirits, rush in an uncontrolled way. What I would add to that is to recognize that they don't come from outside. These phantoms and spirits that rush in an uncontrolled way are within. They are within. Manly Hall, in the Occult Anatomy of Man, tells us that mediums use the solar plexus as a mirror reflecting pictures recorded in the invisible ethers. Here he's talking about the vegetative world. Ill advised retrogression. And I think that is a very significant point, that using the solar plexus, to tap in to the invisible ethers and the beings that one finds there, is an ill advised retrogression. He continues, by thus opening himself to impulses through the solar plexus area, the medium works against his own destiny through the unbalanced activity of the solar plexus, negative psychic phenomena can be produced. By thus opening himself to impulses through the solar plexus area, the medium works against his own destiny. Through the unbalanced activity of the solar plexus, negative psychic phenomena can be produced. Again, that was Manly Hall in the Occult Anatomy of Man. And Manly Hall again, this time Man, Grand Symbol of the Mysteries, from his Man, Grand Symbol of the Mysteries, which is a incredible book. Those unacquainted with the illusionary nature of the astral light may mistakenly ascribe them a spiritual origin. We mistakenly ascribe them a spiritual origin, higher wisdom with dire consequences. Warning: investigations of the evolution of consciousness through the vegetable and animal kingdoms, which we've labeled as Egypt, are tempting and very dangerous. To more positive relationship with the dead, we turn now to the indigenous American and Santeria traditions. Santeria tradition I before mentioned as Cuban, which is my heritage, but today is widely found in many parts of the world, not just North America, in South America and the Caribbean, but in Europe. And as I said, it's spreading like wildfire. So when we take a look at the indigenous religions of America, of Santeria, of shamanism, we'll come to discover that connections with the ancestors is an integral aspect of the soul journeys, where they teach essential lessons about life, the spiritual world, and provide healing recipes. Shango in Santeria has a very deep connection to the spirits of the ancestors, Egun. And I find it interesting that before we can ever reach the Orishas in ceremony, the ancestors are fed. The ancestors are fed first. Then we can call the Orishas. We call them with what? With the bata drums, sacred to Shango and sacred to me as a child of Shango. We call the gods rhythmically. We vibrate the bones of the ancestors, literally, integrating consciousness, rectifying the lineage, experiencing unity consciousness. There are books that describe transition for the living unto the dead. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Todal, the Egyptian Book of the Dead provides instruction to guide souls through a dangerous underworld to the afterlife, to liberation. And interesting, I read her thesis, uh, C.E. Young and the Dead, the Red Book, and Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, 1896 and 1916, by Stephanie Steffens. Her thesis was completed in 2011, and I enjoyed it immensely. I'm aware that she um, converted it into a book under C.E. Young and the Dead is the title by Stephanie Steffens. It's not necessarily a guide to the dead, but it's a very interesting, and Young was a very interesting character, and we're not going to get into psychology per se today, but if interested, I highly recommend Stephanie Stevens's work. To the immutable spirit, the world is a dream, but a dream consistent with itself. Burkhardt. The opposition of inward and outward, of the world of the soul and the physical world is woven into this dream. Burckhardt. We are such stuff as dreams are made on. Shakespeare from The Tempest. I won't say more on this card, on this slide. Getting back to my small little, how would I call it? My small little excerpt from Paul Case's Throne Invisible Rosicrucian Order on the journey of CRC. His short stay in Egypt being completed, Brother CRC sailed over the entire Mediterranean Sea to Fez. Fez represents our intellectual powers, expressed in the head, symbolic of Mercury and Hermes. In Fez, Brother CRC made contact with what is commonly called the elementary inhabitants, who revealed many of their secrets. He dedicated himself to the study of occult arithmetic and geometry, and for making many fine instruments. These instruments were made in his house, the Alchemical Laboratory, and also called the secret vessels, metals, and interior stars. First, in a vain missionary enterprise, and then in occult mathematics on the actual geometrical proportions governing the manifestation of all forms in nature. I think we might have called this mathesis earlier, thus establishing the fundamental theory of the Rosicrucian grade of Theoricus, Yesod, the ninth circle. And with this, we complete this very abridged version of navigating the macrocosm. Yesod, the foundation. From the Zohar, we read, the secret mystery is the foundation. It is the foundation of everything, and everything is a mystery, a secret. The word Yesod, here I wrote from left to right, the hermit, Samek, Vav, Daleth, represented through the tarot cards. We can separate into Sod, which means secret, mystery, and Yod. So the Yesod contains within it the secret of Yod. Yod, in Paul Case's system, represents the intelligence of will. Will, in Hebrew, it's ratzon. The letters, Resh for the sun, is fire. Zadi, Aquarius, is air. Vav for Taurus, is earth. Nun, Scorpio, is water. As I mentioned briefly earlier, they represent the four fixed signs of the zodiac, the four mystical animals of Ezekiel, and the four evangelists, which should actually give us a clue to how to better understand the four gospels. The one I wanted to focus on here is Ezekiel, Ezekiel 10:14. And every one had four faces. The first face was the face of a cherub, cherub for like it's a better pronunciation. And the second face was the face of a man. The Hebrew is Adam. And the third, the face of a lion. And the fourth, the face of an eagle. Now that just struck me. The face of a cherub, And the second was the face of a man, and the third the face of a lion, the fourth the face of an eagle. What happened to the ox? What happened to the face of the ox? It's not explained to us, but it's something we should note. Then a little further down, just 6 lines further, Ezekiel 10:20, we read, "This is the living creature that I saw under the God of Israel by the river of Kebar, the river Kebar. And I knew that they were the cherubims. And I knew that they were the cherubims." Gets stranger and stranger. The four living creatures were the cherubim. The intelligence of will is a synthesis of the elemental powers and forms the patterns of all creatures. The intelligence of will is a synthesis of the elemental powers and forms the patterns of all creatures. The true and invisible Rosicrucian order. The pentagram, a symbol of man. Evola tells us the non-human, in his Hermetic tradition, the non-human creative forces in the body crop up from the power of sexual generation, whose organs are situated precisely in the center of that which physically corresponds to this region, Yesod. The Pythagoreans identified the Vitruvian position, the 5 points aligned with the head, the 2 hands, the 2 feet. And each line of a pentagram geometrically demonstrates extreme and mean ratio, as shown by Euclid, the golden section. What is particularly relevant for us is this little picture in the middle on the right, which shows the orientation of the elements on the tree of life and the place of spirit, Tifereth. This is all too complicated to get into the ratios that are shown by the figure 5, but I provide enough references that the curious student can unfold that mystery. Man is a conglomerate of 4 elements, but his proportions are dictated by the fifth, the spirit plasma, Tiferet, the dawning of Christ consciousness. Oh, I thought we were already done with our Greeks. Anyway, let's go back to Empedocles, who's called the 4 elements rhizomata, roots, and identified them with Zeus, Hera, Aidoneus, and Nestis. Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and Paul, St. Paul, used the word stoichia for the elements, means letter of the alphabet, basic part of a whole, one of a row. Remember, Plato's mathesis had to do with the soul's remembering the divine plan, and that they were made of tiny triangles. It's important to note that Plato, Aristotle, and Euclid and Paul, though they used the word stoichia, they differed in their conception of what it meant with regards to the element. Plato, to be simple and short, focus on transcendence, versus Aristotle, an immanence. And this is really a difference in perception. But a difference in perception that if you look to the literature today, you'll find is still, thousands of years later, is still uh, being engaged by many academic circles and scholars, which is fine. Howbeit then, when you knew not God, says Paul, you did service unto them which by nature are no gods. He's speaking of the elements. But now, after ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you, whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage, whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage. This is from Galatians 4:8-9. Of course, I've discussed this before in a previous talk as well. We're just unfolding a little bit more of the mystery. And this was Paul's warning against the danger of retroversion, regressing to earlier evolutionary stage, which we represented in Egypt. I've warned quite a bit, and it's important because it's easy to fall into vanity. Izzy, the best, taught that within every shell there is a spark. By riding the ass, accepting the trial, you release that spark, transforming the blood that illuminates higher vision. A shift from an observer of form in the sublunary world to understanding the transformative power of Key 14, the Archangel Michael, leading the way to Tiferet, operating through your own vehicle, your own chariot. Paul describes the metamorphosis of consciousness like Apuleius's golden ass. I'm not sure that he'd agree with me, but that's my feeling. And what I want to leave you here with is a sign, a simple quote from Apuleius's golden ass. Behold, I have related to you things of which, though heard of by you, you must necessarily remain ignorant. Here is a quote which I've botched up a little bit to make it fit into our presentation by Ellen Stone Herring. She's very dear to my heart. She was one of my first professors while I was at the University of Florida. And she's a philosophical mother to me. And I wanted to include this because of its relevance. This is found in the Review of Metaphysics in its unsubstantial form in Aristotle's Metaphysics C. It's three parts, which comprise a small book, the three parts put together. In any event, the elements are comparatively indefinite and flaccid. They can be taken up into more determinate beings. There they acquire characters they could not have had on their own, and perform in ways of which they are natively incapable. The something must nevertheless not be existentially other than the elements, or it could not permeate them either. The something is substantial form. Substantial form is an immaterial being conferring unity. The something is substantial form, and substantial form is an immaterial being conferring unity. The word adoption in Greek You see it here on the left. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it at this point. As told to us by Erwin Rode in his Psyche, which is really a fascinating book, he tells us that adoption for the Greeks was a form of initiation, an initiation that conferred upon us an enclosure, an acceptance into a family of the god or the goddess. That adoption represented a new birth. Then he goes on to say that this new birth by initiation reminded him of the Christian idea of rebirth by baptism. Something to think about. Paul in Galatians tells us 4, 6, 7, receive the adoption of sons, and because ye are sons, God hath sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son. And if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. And if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. Tifereth, the soul remembers its divine origin. The soul remembers its divine origin, the Spirit of Christ within the heart equals the quintessence, the substance that transcends the four corruptible elements of the sublunary material world. The quintessence, the substance that transcends the four corruptible elements of the sublunary material world. Get it straight again, where there is nowhere a vacuum and the lion. This is also significant because we're moving up to the next psychic knot that has to deal with a woman that is taming a lion through love. And I find that this is one of the most significant things that modern physics has taught us, that there is nowhere a vacuuming, confirming a statement that came out in the 1600s, 1610 to be exact, in the Fama Fraternitas. Back to Alice and through her looking glass world now, where she's approaching what Henry Corbin calls the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world. Alice finds that just as in a reflection, things are reversed when she goes through the mirror. Running helps one remain still. Staying still helps one move. And it's an example of one of the benefits of meditation, in my opinion. Walking away from something brings it closer. The four elements were chaos, as we saw in the playing cards. In through the looking glass, we've seen a reduction to two, the binary, as reflected in the fact that we have red and white chess pieces and no longer dealing with the four elements. Now, of course, if you paid attention, the four elements are complementary to one another, so that it's easy to see that they can be two. Chess is a duality, light versus dark, self versus other. The four-sided square was reduced to a line, which represents 2 points, a narrowing of focus that may, but does not necessarily, lead to a point of unity. What we start experiencing here as we get closer and closer to Tifereth, which is beauty, is a thinning of space, time, interface, a thinning of the space-time interface. Thoughts are experienced as real, exteriorized, substantial forms. Simultaneously, what was known as solid appears fluid, and the fluid may appear solid. There's a dawning consciousness of the unity of being, a funny little itch in the tip of the nose of the unity of being. This leads to confusion and explains contradictory and indescribable reports of the astral plane. What's important is very important as we start experiencing little glitches in the system, little lights that suggest that we're all a part of one, is the recognition that not all visions, not all psychic perceptions of higher planes or angelic beings are what they seem to be. Caution is a very subtle and very real danger of ego inflation when we misappropriate that which flows through us as that which is ours. Again, of myself, I can do nothing. Transparency and surrender are the keys to navigate some of the dangers. It's important to recognize that the world of creation is invisible unless one has received strength borrowed from the ego. The mediating function of the heart makes it possible to open the pure but essentially unknowable world of the spirit of the Supreme Spirit, or indeed to have any true religious experience, according to Thomas Hackle in his wonderfully thorough book Iranos, an Alternative Intellectual History of the 20th Century. In content, its content is of a spiritual nature, a purely spiritual faculty, independent from the physical organism and able to survive the death of the latter. Again, Thomas Hackle. The content of the imaginal world, of the mundus imaginalis, is of a spiritual nature, a purely spiritual faculty, and is independent from the physical organism and able to survive the death of the latter. Images are essential to activate this mundus imaginalis. Mandalas, symbols, tarot cards. Thomas Hackle. Tarot is the mysterious rote mundi, equivalent to William Schroeder in a Rosicrucian notebook. Opening the mundus imaginalis, the alchemical soul theater, requires strong emotional desire, prayer without ceasing, 1 Thessalonians, meditation and contemplation. The mundus imaginalis is where spirits take on form and the body a spirit. We need our guides because this is a dangerous place where we'll be tested as a part of the tempering. Alchemists burn with water. Note on the left where the image of the tower, Mars. Halavi, his name, Seraphim, which means to burn with fire or destruction by means of fire, purification, a purification that we may not necessarily survive. when not appropriately guided, as mentioned earlier in entering Pardis. Kashmalim, Zan, Warren has on the side of Hesed, means shining substances, shining ones, also lightning. In modern Hebrew, it's referred to as electricity, also known as amber and the electrum. Alchemists burn with water. To the soul triad, to consciousness was a serpent force, Taith, which is depicted in the Tarot by a woman, taming the lion through love. The Mars energy reciprocates between strength and mercy. We become aware of the archangelic presences that are harmonizing with ruling intelligence behind all the vital forces of nature. We gain experience ability to distinguish astral forms true to their higher plane source from those that distort it. This imaginal interface is a doorway to God. Tiferet is is a far higher level of perception. We undoubtedly live in a hierarchy of intelligences, and each development of complexity is a game, is a given a name. Each development of complexity is given a name. All are aspects of the One and Davies. Tiferet is a far higher level of perception. We undoubtedly live in a hierarchy of intelligences, and each development of complexity is given a name. All are aspects of the one God and Davies. Tiferet in formation equals Malkuth in creation, altered consciousness. Creation is the world of creative imagination reserved for the archangels. Archangelic name. Remember, all is within our own being. The force in nature preventing premature spiritual attainment assists in the birth in spirit. The archangelic name, Gabriel, is Yesod of Bria, of creation, and is Da'ath of formation. Gabriel is the moon, the supervisor of dreams, the Sohar. Gabriel is the archangel of the Annunciation, fiery water. Elliot Wolfson, in Language, Eros, Being, and Kabbalistic Hermeneutics, tells us that the corporal image of the incorporeal substance is configured in the imagination as the angel, the imaginal form of the active intellect. The dove we see descending is the Holy Spirit descending towards the Virgin. The dove is the Holy Spirit descending towards the Virgin. Man's intelligence is the angel which mediates between him and his God. Ibn Ezra's Yesod Mora by Strickman. Maria corresponds both to materia prima and to the soul in a state of pure receptivity, Burckhardt, and alchemy of science in the cosmos, science of the soul. Maria's pure receptivity is reflected in her words to the angel Gabriel in Luke 1:38. Be it unto me according to thy word. Be it unto me according to thy word. Antoine Fabre, in his access to Western esotericism, tells us, let us acknowledge a hermeneutic tension inciting us to surmount this constitutive antagonism of our era, thanks to an unceasing work of an ongoing and creative back and forth between the sixth and seventh major arcana tarot cards, the Lovers and the Chariot, work without which the mystery of hermetic tension would not open upon a palingenesis and would risk degenerating each time into a simple model of thought. In the final quote from the Book of Tokens on the meditation on hay, which we see on the right, is the Emperor. In whatsoever object thou perceivest, know me as the essence, as the idea, and as the interior nature. Because of this, the wise come easily to me by many paths. Yet in truth, these different roads are but a single way. In whatsoever object thou perceivest, know me as the essence, as the idea, and as the interior nature. Because of this, the wise come easily to me by many paths. Yet in truth, these different roads are but a single way. This, my friends, is the end of the obligatory, vain missionary enterprise. May the light of love find place in your heart. Amen.